Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tales from the Triptych, newest edition for Sunday, October 17th. Welcome to Trusty Huckster Mercantile, where yours truly, Trusty, will be giving you tales from the world's fairs and World's Fair souvenirs. So tonight we've got the rest of the Triptych is all present and accounted for. So we've got Katie joining us from Vintage and Vinyl.
Hi, guys. Welcome.
And we've got Nate, of course, coming in from the Southern Hemisphere, coming in from New Zealand. We've got Nate from Seoul. Nate.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all.
So appreciate Nate and Katie joining in for the newest Triptych. As we've been doing the Triptychs, it seems like it's a topic that people seem to like. We definitely appreciate comments and feedback, particularly on topics. And what we'd noticed is we'd done several topics that became somewhat brand specific. I had done a couple, Cambridge glass, Rookwood pottery. And Nate just last week did a brand specific one on Wedgwood. And so we wanted to mix things up a little bit. And one of the areas that I find personally interesting, both from just a cultural background as well as from a collecting background, are World's Fairs. A lot of it stems for me from the 1982 World's Fair because I actually attended that in Knoxville, Tennessee. But it's just, a lot of the buildings, a lot of images that we're familiar with came originally from that country's original World's Fair. So we decided I wanted to pull that into a triptych. We're going to kind of talk a little bit about the history of World's Fairs. We're going to talk a little bit about how souvenirs and some of the items that are currently on the market, how valuable or how collectible they are. So we're going to talk about both the fairs and the souvenirs. So I hope you're going to enjoy this evening's triptych. Let's see, with the way we're structured, I can't see the chat. So I'm going to ask Katie, why don't you give us a little update on who we got in the chat tonight?
Absolutely, Patrick. So many folks are tuning in, and it's always exciting seeing you all in the chat. We've got Carrie, KCADX, coming in. Peterson is joining. We've got Deb Sherman, Jan Goodwin, Sam Doyen, stud with a stash. We have Sharon Delaney, and let's see, Tammy Renee Walker. Nate, who else do we see in the chat?
We have Deb Sherman's here. Hi, Deb. We've got, who else have we got? We have Brian. Hi, Brian. How you going? Cam's Folly is here. Teofane, Tim from Canada is here. Hi, Tim. We also have Debbie, Our Vagabond Travels.
And welcome, Debbie. Excellent. Well, thanks so much for so many people showing up. I'll go ahead and get things started, and we'll see how the evening progresses. I've got my new and nifty color-coded tabbing system, which my daughter showed me today. So I'm very excited to use that and make sure I hopefully don't screw it up. So we are telling the tale of World's Fairs. And one of the first things I struggled with is how we're going to define World's Fairs. So like I said, my background really comes from attending a World's Fair in 1982 and learning a little bit about the history from that. I'm going to kind of do a quick little survey to Katie and to Nate. What has been your exposure or knowledge of World's Fairs, historically? Have you attended any, or what do you know about some of them? Katie?
Well, first, Katie?
Yes, I haven't attended any World's Fairs, but it's quite interesting. I was going through my grandparents' things, and we were in the basement, and my grandmother was an expert travel planner. She would have all kinds of notes and history research done on all the places they traveled. And so when we were going through her file of all the places they had been, we found a 1964-1965 New York World's Fair guide where she had circled all the things that they did while they were there. Of course, my mom went, and I just thought that was so cool. And then when I was in Knoxville, I saw the Sun Sphere, which of course was built for the World's Fair in the 80s. I think, Patrick, you said you went to that one. So that's kind of my background with the World's Fair. I honestly don't know a ton about some of the earlier World's Fairs, which I'm excited to learn about. Of course, I know the Eiffel Tower was part of that, and I've seen that in Paris, but there's just so many cool things to learn.
There really is. Now, Nate, one of the things we talked about initially was how New Zealand interacted with the fairs, and you did a little bit of research. I think you were telling me that New Zealand, from your side, you said that New Zealand did have some World's Fairs.
That's right. There was a World's Fair in Dunedin. Actually several. There were three. The first was in 1865, 1889, and also in 1926. The 26 exhibition actually had 3 million visitors to it, and at that time, the New Zealand population was 1.4 million. So,
interesting.
Several of those people went more than once. And during the first half of the 20th century, New Zealand did attend some world fairs. I think there was a St. Louis, a New York, and after 1950, again, there was only a handful. Possibly there was Osaka, Brisbane in Australia, Seville in 92, Japan 2005, and Shanghai. I think we had some representation in 2010.
Okay. Excellent. So and this is kind of giving a snapshot of what I landed on in doing my research. And it does not include any of the New Zealand ones. And somebody I noticed in the chat, Peterson, saying that she attended the Barcelona 91, 92. And here we're showing Plovdiv and Genoa. So I don't know if Plovdiv is actually, I don't know if either of those are in Spain. So there's going to be some different definitions. And what I am using is from a museum. It's the Expo Museum. So it's the list that they've created. And one of the things that I will talk about a little bit is how they changed and how these definitions are structured. I'm going to try and cover the highlights. I obviously can't cover everything. So I'm going to cover the highlights, but there are some really interesting pieces, even with the list that's been created here. I'm sure we could do some research to be like, okay, now New Zealand's not even being left off of maps. It's being left off of lists of World's Fairs. That's a whole other research topic. But like why isn't the Barcelona one listed? Like, what was that technically considered? So I went back with this list, and I will explain a little bit further. It talks about this pre-BIE, that there's relevance to that. There's actually significant relevance when we get to that 64, 65 World's Fair you were talking about, Katie. So the BIE is the Bureau International des Expositions. It's the French pronunciation, so I apologize. I don't speak French. So the BIE didn't even exist until 1931. And by 1931, the Chicago Expo was already being planned. So technically it didn't kick in until after that one. So this is kind of how this one divides it up. So I went into this pre-BIE, and even before I found this site, this is showing the first Expo as 1851 London. That is generally the first Expo most people recognize.
So, Patrick, is Expo and World's Fair, are they interchangeable titles, are they?
Colloquially, yes, but technically the World's Fairs were different from the Expos. This one, because it's the Expo Museum, has tied it together. The BIE, anything prior to 1931 technically can't be considered a World's Fair because it was the BIE that created the World's Fair system. So it's, in some cases, it is interchangeable, but then you get into certain technology fairs and manufacturing fairs that don't cross into this. So this calls them all expos, including ones that everyone would generally call a World's Fair. So this one does kind of interchange the two.
Great.
The 1851 one wasn't really considered a World's Fair. It wasn't even considered an expo. It was and I should have written down the name, I forgot. But it was basically the first time, prior to 1851, London and Paris had always been having these, every couple of years. They tried not to step on each other, but those shows that they did, or those events, were pretty much just national. So, the London one really just showed technological advances within the UK and maybe a little bit of Europe, but for the most part, it was the UK. Same thing with the Paris would show all the French ones. And it was 1851 that really started as the first truly international, where there was actually an invitation sent out saying, this is what we want to do, and we want other countries to be represented. So when they created the 1851 Expo, the famous piece from that is the glass palace, or the Crystal Palace.
Crystal Palace, right.
And so the Crystal Palace is this ginormous structure here. And so this is one of the promotional pieces promoting the palace. And the palace actually existed, you know, it's like another illustration. Because again, we're talking about 1851. So in many cases, there's not as much documentation for everything that was there. But it was primarily housed just in this one building. A lot of the later ones kind of took over multiple acres of parks and had multiple buildings for different purposes. This one pretty much was all in this one gigantic building from 1851 until 1936, when it burned to the ground. So you've still got the ironwork structure that was built behind it, but that is the main structure. One of the things that's notable for both World's Fairs and for Expos, most of them, not all, most of them had some level of structure that was built to remain. So in the 1851, they made this gigantic structure. They were very proud of it. They maintained it, and it unfortunately caught fire. Later ones, when they got into multiple buildings, most of the buildings they were purposely built to only be up for a year or two, or in some cases they were built to be mobile so they could be moved someplace else. But usually there'd be one or two structures that would stick around. And like Katie, you mentioned the Paris one, the Eiffel Tower was actually built for the Paris Expo in 1889. So, you know, that was kind of the structure that was left behind. But because of the older one, I do want to talk about the collectability and popularity of some of the fairs. This suddenly we're dealing with a fair that's, it's 170 years ago. There are items that are out there in the eBay world that claim to be, and that's unfortunately something that you have to keep in mind, claim to be items from the 1851 exposition. But you'll see this change as we go through some of the later fairs. There's only 11 right now, even listed on eBay as items that claim to be or were definitely from that 1851 exhibition. So I've got them sorted by the most valuable to least. So you've got this Prince Albert consort of Queen Victoria, a medal. You've got this plate, another medal, this is a pot lid. And what's interesting about this pot lid is this is currently selling for on auction with no bid starting at $20. If you jump over to the highest price of sold items, just because you're asking for a certain amount doesn't mean you're going to get it. But if you look at the sold items, actually the porcelain pots are the ones that are going for the bigger bucks. So these are pieces that actually say Exhibition 1851 right on them. And so you've got the most valuable piece. And again, this is just showing over the last 90 days, but it gives you a snapshot that there are pieces that are available. They're representing the Crystal Palace, and they are going for, a couple $100. And then you dip down into the metals. So I ended up getting 16 bids, but it only ended up going for $56. What will become a common theme as you go through the collectability of the different World's Fairs is a lot of it will be based on the time and the age. Also, just the location of it. If somebody has a personal connection to it, they will want to collect something just from the World's Fair. But the things that get the bigger price tags end up being, just like all other collectibles, is the stuff that has cross collectability. People collect porcelain and these powder jars all the time. And so the idea that you could have a powder jar that was displayed or used or sold at an 1851 World's Fair just suddenly cranks that piece up into a much higher price point. So there's not a lot of pieces. Again, there's only 6 of them that have been sold in the last 90 days. So you won't come across them as often. So it's a fairly safe bet that if you find something that's legitimately marked, from the fair, that there's going to be some value to it. And then it's just trying to find the right buyer.
Now, what I find interesting about this particular one you're showing here is it says exhibition on it. Since you talked about World's Fair really coming to be that term until 1930, right? So
right.
I think that's pretty cool. Now, are there any types of reproductions of these?
There will be some level of reproduction, probably just about for everything. I didn't come across, as I was researching it, anything that was nothing was purposely valuable enough to be considered a knockoff. But some people would be making porcelain pots, maybe with a picture of the Crystal Palace because it's pretty. you can still buy lithographs, you can still buy etchings that show the Crystal Palace because it was just a really cool structure, but they wouldn't necessarily try and say they were from 1851. They would just be representing something from 1851. So it's definitely worth doing a little bit of the research, particularly because there just aren't that many pieces that are out there. So if you suddenly come across a box of 100, that would probably be questionable because there's probably not that much that would be available to access. So that was really the first international exhibition because, again, we were bouncing back and forth between London and Paris up to that. Paris ended up having a ton. Paris and also had their first in 1855. So the first Paris exhibition of 1855, then they did 1867, then 78, then 89, and that's what brought us the Eiffel Tower. Then 1900, which the noteworthy of 1900 is that was where Campbell Soup was introduced. The Paris Metro was unveiled during the 1900 World's Fair. And if you've ever seen images, I should have grabbed one. If you've ever seen images of the Paris Metro, it's that very curvy Art Nouveau, exactly what would have been popular in 1900. The first Olympics held outside of Greece were held during the World's Fair. So it's during the Paris World's Fair of 1900. And then there are two buildings I mentioned before. Sometimes buildings get built and they stick around. These are the buildings that are still around, the Grand and the Petit Palais. So this is, like it says right here, although most of the buildings were demolished, the Grand Palais, the Petit Palais is, one of them is the Beaux-Arts Museum. And then the larger one is just used for performance pieces. So in most cases, again, they would put some sort of architectural significance. Now, some of them were architecturally impressive, but they were made out of plaster. So they were literally made to fall apart after a year or two. But a lot of times in like Chicago, as we'll talk about, it was the art building that was what they built to stick around because they needed it to be fireproof. They needed it to be, in some places earthquake proof. So they tended to be the most solidly built buildings, which meant those were the ones that stuck around. And that's what the Grand and the Petit Palais were. So those were from the 1900. 1937 and 1947, those are the next two that did Paris. If you dust off your history books, those are some interesting years to be trying to pull together an international exposition. And they weren't very successful. And there wasn't a lot created during that time. There was some international participation, but the Germany had not invaded anyone yet, but the political culture was already starting to change within Paris or within Europe by 1937. Germany invaded Poland in 1939. So, we were very close to the beginning of the war. And then the 1947, we're only a couple of years after the war. So the idea of trying to pull together a World's Fair less than 2 years after the war ended is a little almost crazy. But in 1937, they did still go ahead. And what's interesting for the cities that created multiple World's Fairs, in some cases, they were reusing some of the base, some of the land that they had already used. So this is, and again, I don't know my French, the Charlotte Palace. They turned that into, that was something they built back up in 1937. I got some varying definitions of it because there wasn't a lot of new architecture being put into there. But that was one of the pieces that stuck around. And then in 1947, there's literally almost nothing about it because, again, you figure it was originally supposed to be held in 1945. Yeah, we were a little busy then. So then it got pushed to 1946, then it got pushed again to 1947, and it only lasted a month. So it was technically a World's Fair or an expo that lasted only a month. So there was only 14 countries that participated. It's notable in the sense that was the last World's Fair that was held in Paris. But I wanted to show all of them because obviously with the introduction of the Eiffel Tower, it was the 1900 World's Fair. The Eiffel Tower was already there. And I did not know this, but evidently the Eiffel Tower has been painted different colors on 18 occasions. And it was
Wow.
the 1900 World's Fair was the only time it was ever been painted yellow. So it was sometimes it was referred to as the Golden Eiffel Tower Fair because that's the only time it was ever painted a gold or a yellow color.
That's interesting. I do remember that the Eiffel Tower was not loved by all. There was a famous artist at the time, Guy de Maupassant, who said he ate his lunch every day in the restaurant at the Eiffel Tower because it was the only place in Paris that he could eat without having to look at the monstrosity that it was.
Well, most people at the time, they felt it was undone. Like for the bulk of that structure existed, but it was usually, the underside of a bridge, or, you'd put some like glass over it or something to cover it. So the fact that they left it exposed was definitely very daring, particularly considering 1889. But it's funny because if somebody had asked me what year that was built, I'm not sure I would have picked the 1889 World's Fair. So there are fairs that are more significant than others in what's left behind. I personally had never heard of the Grand or Petit Palais. I'm sure it's a lovely structure in Paris, but it's not going to hold a candle to the Eiffel Tower.
Now, Patrick, I've got an interesting question for you.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that one of the World's Fairs only lasted a month. So how long did these typically last?
In general, they usually lasted about 6 months. There didn't seem to be a structure. As they got more into the modern, not that we weren't like not modern, but as we got into more contemporary times, the length of the fair was often dictated based on the cost of the fair. So they would try and make sure that the fair would last long enough to recoup its investment. So there were fairs, including the New York World's Fair of 1939, because, again, let's dust off our history books. That was when Europe entered World War I, or World War II was in 1939. So the New York, even though America hadn't entered the war, it really killed a lot of Europeans from coming into the United States to see it. And it really questioned the international popularity of it. It didn't make any money. So, in some cases, they were trying to structure these to make sure there was at least a break even, if not a full-fledged profit. So I never found a consistent length, but I did find many references to say because of the cost, this fair lasted 2 years. Like there were some that went really long.
So the point of these fairs, Patrick, when other countries would send people and exhibitions to these fairs, was that to promote tourism for their own country, or was it to promote their goods for trade?
It changed over time. As I was doing the research on them, the earlier ones were a lot, and I'd say it's maybe gone ebb and flow, because a lot of them, the 1851 in particular, the first one, it was all about technology. It was like, well, what are steam engines doing? What are the coolest developments that we've come across that we want to show off that our country has invented, or that our country has fine-tuned or developed. In some cases, it was like things were introduced in different fairs that technically already existed, but were suddenly displayed in mass or became popular at the World's Fair because maybe they were popular in a region or popular within a specific country, and particularly things like food products and things like that, where they technically existed. Like Dr. Pepper existed before the 1904 World's Fair, but the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair was the first time that Dr. Pepper actually sold itself outside of Texas. So it existed, but nobody knew what it was. And then it became super popular because Dr. Pepper is awesome. And then the more recent World's Fairs are almost all based on technology, environmental advances. It's really, tourism is kind of a side piece, and that's where some of the sideshows and things came from. We'll definitely talk about that as we go. But they were typically some sort of industrialization, urbanization, machinist hall were very popular. People like to see the technological developments.
Yeah, and in the New York World's Fair, they had a General Electric Progress Land, and basically you can look up, there's videos of that online, but it basically shows all the progress of the time of all the latest kitchen technology and anything really that GE made, which I just find fascinating, because some of the stuff that they show in that video, it's like, these are just things that we're used to having, you know, in
Yep.
our house now. But then that was like, whoa, that's so cool.
Well, and even the Eiffel Tower, I mean, since that's a slide that I happen to stop on, you know, this wasn't like, let's just make something pretty. This was freaking huge compared to anything else being built at that time. So you may consider it ugly, but as a engineering marvel, it's amazing. You know, so it's like from people coming in from rural areas or countries that don't have this type of engineering, this would have been a technological marvel in and of itself that they would just marvel at, because how did you get this thing to stand so tall? And would you be willing to go up in the elevator? Because there was a gravity elevator. There was two elevators. When one went up, the other one went down. And then when that one went up, the other one came down. Like that was the entire mechanism. Are you willing to try that if you've never been in a building more than 4 stories tall? And then you've got the hot air balloons, like just a lot. People were always showing off their newest stuff or the newest advances. There was one that had like 100 electric cars. So it wasn't that it invented the car, but it suddenly had a display of all of the cars. So you could sit there and compare like, okay, what are people doing with electric cars? But where it comes into, because Paris had so many, it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. When you start looking at collectability, yes, there will be people that will want, you know, they will want to collect the 1889 one because that's the one that the Eiffel Tower came from. So, you know, there will be people that get very specific. But what I pulled up was simply a search on Paris World's Fair, and you can see the jump from the London to the Paris. Even though this is a much more general term, there's still only 350 items. And even some of those are questionable. Like, why is this saying both Paris 1900 and there was a Buffalo Fair in 1901? You know, what exactly is this piece? Sometimes it's just catching the best search terms. Right. But, you know, here's a plaque from 1892. A shawl that claims to be from 1855, but it was a Paris shawl. So, you know, there's definitely going to be a lot of searching you'll want to do. But as you look at what has sold, the things that are getting the biggest bucks would be items like, you know, ephemera items that would still be around, you know, after such a long period of time. So 1937, it wasn't a huge fair. It wasn't particularly well attended. Suddenly you have a poster, a piece of ephemera that's still around. Yeah, it's going to go for $600. You know, it's and for people not as familiar with eBay, when it shows something like $695 and it's crossed out, it shows here it's best offer accepted. They might have accepted $675, $650, $500. You know, you don't know. It's just less than $695. Again, a snuff box, just like the porcelain ones that we had from the London exhibition. Now we got a snuff box going for $565.
That's beautiful.
Piece of lace for $495. You know, again, like, how do we know this is from the exhibition? I have no idea. But these are the types of big ticket items that these were not mass produced. You know, this was a World's Fair medal issued during the World's Fair. So somebody won this probably for their booth. There's probably 100, maybe 200, depends on how many, you know, how many people exhibited. But the big ticket items will be the rare items. And there's not as much mass produced stuff, particularly for the earliest ones. You'd expect more in the 1937, 1947, but because they were so poorly attended at such a politically, you know, volatile time, there may just not be that much out there. So, you know, some of those pieces will probably go for big money too. But you can see even items from the 1878, you know, exhibition, so the third one in Paris, it still only went for $125. Right. You know, so it's one of those cases that these things aren't necessarily huge ticketed items, because you're getting into, no one is alive that attended the 1878 exposition. You know, it's just not going to happen. But it did have a hot air balloon, which is kind of cool. So collectability, Paris stopped doing them in 47. There's still going to be people who love, you know, anyone who loves Paris, loves French, the Francophiles, their items will be popular. But again, that cross popularity is going to be the biggest one. People that collect coins, people that collect cookbooks, you know, all of these are going to kind of go up. People that collect textiles, this probably went as high as it did. I mean, it only got one bid, but it probably got sold because somebody was a lace collector, and suddenly you've got a piece of lace from a very specific point in time. Cool. You know, you're going to want to add that to your collection, and you're going to fight somebody for building up the World's Fair collections too.
And I would imagine during the Great Depression, here in the States anyway, there probably wasn't a ton of people buying souvenirs, because I wouldn't imagine that would be high on the list of things that you needed in your house at that time.
I would agree with that in general, but then it kind of covers the ones that at what point during the Depression, because the 1933 Chicago World's Fair has some of the most prevalent collectibles out there, because that now we've moved into a mass production area where suddenly you could just make more and they were cheap. So it's like, okay, you're trying to forget the Depression, so you're going to go spend, 50 cents or, $1 to attend it. And just, you want to forget yourself and you're going to pay a nickel to bring home a souvenir. It's just to kind of maybe block out the fact that you're unemployed or whatever. So, but it's definitely going to have an impact. But then you balance the fact that all the stuff from the 1889 Paris exhibition would have been handmade and, have like some artisan, collectability built into it. If you're, cranking out a stack of postcards, that's a lot cheaper to take home, and there are a lot of them out there.
Angela's got a great question coming in. Oh, go ahead, Nate.
No, you go, Katie, please.
Angela was asking, was there World's Fair items made outside of the actual fair, like made and sold in other states, advertising the different fairs?
There is definitely going to be some advertising that will refer to the World's Fair. That would have been sold in, like, particularly for the American ones. I can't speak as much for the international ones, but the companies that were based in San Francisco, if they had any sort of connection to the St. Louis World's Fair, the Chicago World's Fair, there was actually a fair in San Francisco. So that might be a bad choice, but in one of the non-San Francisco years, they might put some advertising out there and say, as seen at the World's Fair, or as made available, or as introduced, to get that connection. Actually, if you flash back to my triptych on Rookwood, there were Rookwood won medals at the 1889 Paris exhibition. And so they were announcing here in the United States, they were advertising and making pieces about the Paris Expo because they won. So there's definitely going to be pieces and souvenirs that would reference it, probably not promoting the fair as much, more, a product that was somehow tied to the fair.
Okay, interesting.
So again, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of fairs. So I can't pick all of them. So I kind of highlighted the ones that I wanted to focus on. And the 1876 one was a fairly significant one in one area because it was the first one in the United States. Now, we still haven't gotten into the organization of the BIE, but it's worth mentioning because all they did was make official the kind of a standing rule that they'd existed before. You really weren't supposed to have more than one World's Fair in the same country more than once every 10 years. So the fact that the 1876 exposition in Philadelphia, that was the first time in the United States, kind of started the clock to see how many are we going to be able to host. And it was posted, of course, as the Centennial Exhibition, as the Centennial of America. So it was 1776 to 1876. And this most significant display here was, believe it or not, the Statue of Liberty didn't get built until the 1880s, but they had finished her arm in time for the 1876 exhibition. So her arm was on display with the torch and you could climb into it. And they were trying to raise money for the pedestal. So it still didn't get built for another 10 years, but they had a piece of it to kind of celebrate the gift from France. It was made in France and they shipped it over to us. So the Philadelphia Exposition, 1876, most fairs had something that stuck around. This was the art hall that they built in Philadelphia that still exists now. So this one is, it houses the Please Touch Museum, is currently one of the buildings that still exists from the 1876 World's Fair. So there's a lot of great videos and articles that talk about like what happened to them now, or like what's the situation now. And what I liked about this one is because it was an American exposition, some of the states actually had their own pavilions. And this is one, Ohio actually sent an entire stone house, was built and was built on the site of the exposition grounds. And it's still standing. It's still there.
Wow.
So this house is still there. But it just like this goes into, but in general, most of them were not built to last. They were built, you know, in some cases, particularly as you got later, some cases they were legally required to remove them by a certain time because the land was going to be used for something else. And sometimes it was very specific what you were allowed to leave versus what you were required to tear down. So they usually knew at the time they were building it, they knew what was going to stick around and what wasn't. So the problem, surprisingly, because it's such a significant World's Fair or Expo for America, there are more items available, but it's difficult to find specifically 1876 because a lot of stuff celebrated 1876. So a lot of it's a 1876 special, you know, centennial item, but not necessarily from the Philadelphia Expo. So, you know, some of the items that are out there, this is one of them, like one of the more valuable items. It's actually a model that was created for one of the exhibits. It was a mining display, and it was a hand-built model by this artist, W.H. Holmes, that represented the Colorado mining industry. And so it's just the model of the actual exhibit. Now, this is just what it's listed for. I have no idea what it's, you know, but it's an art. It's basically an art piece because it's one of a kind. It literally was made by the architect. That's the only one that exists. 15 people are watching it, but it hasn't sold.
Don't you wonder how they find things like that, though? And
yeah,
how they
probably somebody in the Holmes family, you know, it got passed down. You figure that was like 150 years ago. Goes through 3 or 4 generations, some with some tag stuck to the bottom, because to me, I wouldn't know what that was. If somebody handed it to me, I'm like, thank you. It looks like a moonscape. I wouldn't even known what it was. You know, things like this pop up a lot, that it is a centennial table. So it's it's representing the 100th, you know, anniversary of the country, but it's not specifically for the exposition. So that's just one of the things to keep in mind when if you're collecting specifically Philadelphia. And it is a popular thing to collect because people like centennial things. They like Philadelphia. They like American history. There's a lot of cross collectability. So items will end up going for big bucks. It's just sometimes very hard to determine, well, is this a 100 year something from the exposition, or is it just something that celebrated 100 years of America? So it really need to say something in there. Like this one actually has a stamp saying it sold for $550, an exposition commemorative medal. Now this is saying there were 10,000 minted. To me, that's a lot, but over 100 years, 150 years, maybe a lot of them are missing.
Jeannie has mentioned that she has some red glass tourist cups from the St. Louis World Fair.
Those red glass tourist cups are so fantastic. They're very collectible, and they were very inexpensively made. So it was something that looked really pretty. You'd buy it specifically to go into your curio cabinet or whatever, because you'd want everyone to know that you traveled to those. And those ruby red, and they basically between like 1880s to around, they kind of died off around 1910s. The World's Fair ones are really, really popular. They don't necessarily go for big bucks, but they are definitely collected. And a lot of collectible.
They're beautiful.
She says that one of them has Katie's her great grandmother's name on it, which is very cool.
Wonderful.
My great grandmother Esther's name on it, I believe.
Fantastic. And because they were typically sold as the souvenir, those will say, the argument comes in some cases, they might just say 1904. Well, that it could have been bought in 1904 in Boston. Like, you don't know it's the 1904 World's Fair. So a lot of times, because they were souvenirs, they'll say 1904 World's Fair or 1904, and that one is officially called the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition. So sometimes that's a little long to engrave on a glass, but so you're going to see different things. It might say 1904 St. Louis, in which case you could make an educated guess. The St. Louis World's Fair ran from April to December of 1904. So if you see something that says 1904 St. Louis, well, there's only 3 months that it would have not been a World's Fair. So it's a pretty good guess that that's what you have.
Right.
I think ours just says 1904 St. Louis, and that has
there you
my mother's name. But they lived in St. Louis, so and they talked about going to the World's Fair quite a bit.
Perfect. So Chicago actually ended up having 2 World's Fairs. The first one was the 1893 Columbia Exposition, which was supposed to be a celebratory of Columbus's 400th anniversary of his crossing, but Chicago didn't quite make 1892. So it moved in 1893. So the 1893 is notable for a couple of reasons. The biggest one is that it was only 20 years after the Chicago fire. So there was a lot of questions of whether this should even continue to be planned for Chicago, because the city was literally still rebuilding itself from a fire that devastated a third of the city and killed hundreds of people and knocked down miles of buildings. There was a question, and they decided quite the opposite. No, this is exactly why it should be in Chicago, because we are a city risen from the ashes and we're going to build the city. Now, there was a lot of political turmoil tied to this, because it was known as the White City. And you can see just from this overview, everything that was built was in a classical style, and it was all painted white stucco, which was not what Chicago was rebuilding itself with. Chicago was starting to introduce skyscrapers. They were starting to introduce, taller structures, a lot of steel construction, because we were moving away from wood construction, because that's what, we had wood sidewalks. Like, that's why the city just burned to the ground, because once that fire started, everything was combustible. So they really introduced, Chicago became one of the best firefighting cities in the world. People would come to Chicago to study, what we were doing to prevent fires and put things out. So it was a big deal that what we were building Chicago as, and then they built the World's Fair completely in the face of what Chicago was doing. So there was definitely it was a beautiful World's Fair, very well represented, very well attended, but it wasn't technically a showpiece for Chicago. This piece here is actually noteworthy because this, again, it was built as the art exhibit, like this Palace of Fine Arts. This was built as the art exhibit at the World's Fair. This is the only building that still exists from the fairgrounds. Technically, the Art Institute was also built at the same time, which is in this if you know Chicago, it's in the downtown area in the Loop. It was built at the same time. It was technically built, they said, as part of the World's Fair, but it wasn't connected by any of the transportation to it. It just kind of dates from the same era. So this is really a purpose-built structure for the World's Fair, for the Columbia Exposition, that they kept, because, again, this had like 18-inch thick walls. It was all brick. It was all stone. It was housed to hold art, and it is now the Museum of Science and Industry. It's unfortunate from the geography of Chicago that there's already a museum campus closer to downtown. This is not walkable to it. And it's also not, even if you could walk to it, if you like really wanted to walk like Forrest Gump, you would be running through an area you don't want to run through. So it's unfortunately, it's kind of segregated, but it's a beautiful museum, very well attended. You just have to drive or bus to it. So that is one of the structures that does still exist.
And when was that built, Patrick?
So this is for the first Chicago. So this is for the 1892. So it was probably built in 1892. It's for the 1893 exposition. So these buildings are all from the first one. So that one,
very, very similar to our Auckland Museum, which almost identical style. And I think that was built in 29 or something like that. But you could easily mistake the two buildings.
Yeah, again, like so much of what was built was just getting into that classical, neoclassical, it's a university Gothic, a very generic style, which is why so many people that were in the architecture of Chicago, why they didn't like it. They're like, you could lift this and put it anywhere in the world, and it would be a great World's Fair, but it wouldn't represent Chicago. But, that was not uncommon at the time. So that was the biggest structure. So that's the one that stuck around. So unlike the Eiffel Tower that was really, really tall, this one was just really, really big. And so that was the building that stuck around. Of local interest from my locality, this boat still exists. It was a representation of a replica of a Viking ship. It is currently sitting in a warehouse in Geneva, Illinois, a far west suburb near where I live, trying to collect the funds to restore it and put it on display. We do
have a couple of questions, Patrick.
Absolutely. Jump them in.
How do folks decide who gets to host a World Fair?
So I will go into that a little bit more when I get into the description of the BIE, which is actually coming up pretty quick.
Right.
They're the ones that pretty much define it.
And also, Jeannie has asked, is it true that the ice cream cone was invented at a World's Fair? Do you know if that's true?
You are 100% correct. That one was invented. I wrote that one down. That one, I think, was the 1904. Yeah, I think it was the 1904. The St. Louis World's Fair had the first ice cream cone.
Wow, interesting.
And the Chicago World's Fair of 1893 had Cracker Jacks.
Very, very interesting, Patrick.
I'm not sure I know what a Cracker Jack actually is.
It's basically caramel coated popcorn, but there's also like, is it peanuts that are in there?
Yes, peanuts.
Yeah, so it's like and then the big thing for Cracker Jack is there's a toy in the bottom.
Okay,
so that was invented at the Chicago World's Fair, and I thought I'd written down. There's a bunch of stuff that came in at the 1904. Oh yeah, 1904 waffle style ice cream cone was introduced at the St. Louis World's Fair. So this boat. So any other questions?
Nope, that was it.
Yeah, I'm going to plow through. Just yell out if any of you got questions. Some noteworthy things. Now, one of the things that's worth noting, and it kind of happened a little bit before Chicago, but Chicago really kind of refined it and established it. The World's Fair Planning Commission was the one that made the White City. So like there was a pond and there were boats and there were these buildings and all these different places, and they represented, the machinery hall and the fine arts and all the big representation from all the countries. They also established the Midway Plaisance, and most people have heard of the Midway. This is where it got its start. And the most impressive piece that was at the Midway was the Ferris Wheel. So the Ferris Wheel existed before the 1893 Exposition, but it became its own scale. So it's kind of hard. You can look around, like see this building over here on the left. That's like a 5-story building. Wow. Each one of these carriages is the size of a train car. So this is how big this was. You could see it better than anything else in the fair. It was the tallest structure in the fair. But again, it was not meant to be kept permanently up. It was established. It was up for 2 years, but it's the Ferris wheel. And so it was replicated in other places. It did get bigger in other places. Some people argue that this is the biggest one. There's some data to indicate that there were a couple of others that were made bigger. But this is made by Mr. Ferris, and it has some of the same structural capacities as the Eiffel Tower. So they were using that technology and just making it on a much, much bigger scale. So the Midway kind of started becoming a thing. And so what the Midway became was, okay, you've got all the really fancy stuff. And if you've seen like Meet Me in St. Louis, they all visit the St. Louis World's Fair. They're all in their big white lace dresses, and the men are wearing their bowler hats, and everyone's dressed up nice. That was where the middle class and the wealthy would spend their days. This is where some of them and most of the lower class would spend their nights. This was the sideshows. This was the beer halls. This was the Ferris wheel. This was the place you went to have fun. Everything else was really interesting, and you were educated and you were impressed. Here was where you just went for a good time. So you had the Ferris wheel was one of the most noteworthy. Some people might recognize this picture. If you do not recognize this picture, one of the other noteworthies from 1893 World's Fair was the serial killer H.H. Holmes. This is where he lived, and this is where he would pull people from the Midway. He would basically get them to come to his home. Seduce may be too strong of a word, but he would trick them into coming to his home, and he would then kill them. So The Devil in the White City is the book that was made about this. So that was also in the area off the Midway. That he wasn't pulling people in their white bowler hats and their white lace dresses from the main part of the fair. He was pulling from the Plaisance. So that's fairly noteworthy. And unfortunately, this was something that Nate had shared with me. I would not have found probably on my own. That again, it's where some of the sideshows were kind of being built up. And I almost cringed my use of those own words, because a lot of what was being put on display were natural. They were the representation from their nations being put on display as a sideshow. And so do you want to talk a little bit about this picture, Nate?
Apart from the glaringly obvious error of putting a bunch of Maori dancing girls in front of a relief map of Australia, it's pretty insulting on all levels, really.
Because who are the Maori?
The Maori are New Zealand Aboriginals.
There you go.
Whereas the Aboriginals are referred to as Aboriginals are the Australian Aboriginals. It's a fascinating picture, this. I know at the I think it was the 1911 Expo that was in London. There were 50 Maori people who lived in a mocked up traditional Maori village, which in many ways nowadays would be considered a bit of a human zoo, totally unacceptable now.
Exactly. And that's why I do include it here, because unfortunately, some of the collectability of items from these World's Fairs, particularly as you get into the 20th century, unfortunately actually are from that. It's the idea of the cultural appropriation or the mistreatment of some of the individuals. Now, in many cases, I'd like to think it's not because we're trying to perpetuate the mistreatment, but it's to be able to capture that, like, those who forget their history are bound to repeat it, to say, look, we would all be offended by this. Even at a minimum, like you said, if these are Maoris, they should be in front of a map of New Zealand. If this is going to exist at all, this should exist in front of at least the right culture. But probably shouldn't exist at any point in our current, our current climate. That is some of the more collectible items. I've never dealt in anything like that, but you get a lot of postcards. This looks like it was probably a stereo card. You get a lot of items that, as this properly is in a museum right now, they should be studied and researched to understand why did this happen. Because the New Zealand government probably sent them, or did the Australian government send them? Like, who put them in front of a Australian map?
I'm sure it would have been the New Zealand government that would have sent them. And I would imagine that some organizer there at the fair itself thought, oh, well, Australia's close enough. We don't have a big, massive mock-up of New Zealand, so let's put them in front of that. They probably won't know the difference.
Yeah, because if you look really closely at the sign, it says Australasian Village, and it does say New Zealand in text. But once again, New Zealand has been kept off the map, so we only have Australia. And American, a lot of people visiting probably wouldn't know what New Zealand looked like if it wasn't put into context against Australia. So I show it as something because it is significant when it comes to collectability of souvenirs. There is a very strong collectability for things that are probably inappropriate. Let's give the benefit of the doubt that it's because you want to capture that point of history so that it doesn't get forgotten. But it does sometimes make you cringe a little bit when you see it, saying, okay, yeah, we probably shouldn't have even taken a picture of that or had it even happen.
I'm sure any New Zealand historian would be absolutely fascinated by this picture.
Exactly. So there's merit to having a study of it. It's where you hope it doesn't, get passed on as a continuation for it, saying, oh, let's return to these days. Let's learn from these days so we don't let them happen again. So those were all from the 1893. And I'm going to show you then the 1933, because again, we talked a little bit earlier. The 1933 was when a lot of stuff really started coming in from the collectability standpoint. First we're moving into, 1933, we're past World War I. We really didn't have the deco, time, because we got the Depression kind of hit us right at the height of the deco. So in 1933, we started introducing kind of more the concept of getting into modern. So there is a difference between Art Deco and Art Moderne, and then you move into some others. In the 30s, like as you're leading up to World War II, there's some very distinct architectural styles and even the fonts that are getting like pseudo deco, but are trying to get it a little bit more austere as we got into the war years. So this one was again from May to November. So this one was only about a 6-month period. But some amazing structures were built. And a lot of these are coming from postcard images that is the #1 area of collectability for just about everything from about the Chicago 33 World's Fair on. They may have existed in the earlier ones. I didn't cover too much in the 1900, 1920s, but this is where the full color was coming in. The printing was cleaner. There are a lot of postcard images, and I used several of them, showcasing some of what we had at the 33 World's Fair. So that was the Travel and Transportation Building. This one is the Sears Roebuck Building, because Sears Tower wasn't built until the 70s. So this was a store that basically had its own representation at the Chicago World's Fair. Now, Sears was based in Chicago, but they built this entire structure. And if you can look at scale, here are the people going up the ramp to get in the door.
I mean,
this building's huge.
Is that a Carillion, Patrick?
Carillon? I don't know. I don't think so, because I believe this was all part of the building. I think you could go up there. I don't think it was a bell tower.
Is that still there, Patrick?
No, this is not. This building did not remain. This was a temporary structure. This was representative of a thermometer, which just is freaking awesome. Let's get the oil can for this one. Haviland Motor Oil. Again, you can see the steps going up to it. Look at how small these people are compared to the structure of the thermometer.
That is amazing.
They definitely had some architecture going into some of these, because we're in the 30s, so you've learned a lot more. Your structures can get a lot taller. Chicago's first skyscraper, I think, was only 15 stories tall, and people thought we were amazing. Now 15 stories is nothing, but you have to figure out how to build. So it took time. And so this was the Federal Building. Again,
speaking of building, Patrick, do you know of any incidents that happened during the World's Fair due to still kind of learning and developing certain building techniques, or were all of the buildings structurally okay?
I'm sure there are some, but I have to say I did not come across anything any stories that would have. My concern would be these buildings that were built as temporary buildings, like, well, how do you know when they were supposed to fall apart? So there probably are stories. I just never came across those, but those would be fascinating. So then again, a lot of this was an American World's Fair. It was all about commerce. There were a lot of companies that were represented. So like in the Philadelphia one in 1876, you had states being represented. Here, these people, General Motors, just said, hey, we're going to talk about Chevrolet, Oldsmobile, Buick, Frigidaire. We're going to go to town, and we're, again, build this massive temporary structure for something that was only around for a year to get people to know, again, that technological advances, one place to see all of the new refrigerators, all of the new styles of cars, all of these things that we were basically like trying to get ourselves out of the Depression. Hey, you used to get a car every 2 years. You've now gone through unemployment and the Depression. Life sucks. Things are getting better because we don't know the war is coming. Look at all these cool cars that you should buy. So GM had this fantastic building. I loved this one. These are giant representations of magazines. So the Time and Fortune building at the Century of Progress. So like this, again, this looked like more like a restaurant. So this isn't a huge scale, but again, look at the guy. This isn't a building. It's just a billboard, but just the look at the graphics on that. It's just a cool representation of the time. This was a great, again, getting into that stylized, that modern kind of like reminiscent of Deco look of the Sky Ride, which looks super cool. Less cool is the actual Sky Ride. I would be terrified to be on this thing. So it's like a very real picture, so you get to see like this is what it really looked like in 1930s. So it's actually a pretty good picture of it. But it's a little bit more, not gonna say rickety, but that would definitely be something people are not used to seeing or being that high up. But definitely.
Now this is something I don't know, Patrick, but would you just pay a flat admission to the World's Fair? Or when you went inside like the Sky Ride, did you have to pay for it?
You had to pay for more. I'll talk a little bit as we get into 1904 because there was a really weird and interesting substructure. But in most cases, what would end up happening is you would pay for the entrance to the fair, and that money would go to the developers of the fair. So like if you think back when I was talking about the Midway Plaisance, there was no access to the Midway that anybody could go into. You didn't have to buy a ticket to the fair. So they really needed the money from the fair. But then even within the organized fair, if there were restaurants, if there were entertainment like shows, you would have to pay extra for those. And then that money would go to the people that actually had that exhibit. So it was like not quite a nickel and diming thing. It was just one of those that, like I give you the example for the 1904, the attendance to get into the fair was 50 cents. And there was a specific exhibit that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail, but there was a specific exhibit. The exhibit itself was 25 cents. So considering that's like half the cost of what it costs to get into the building or into the grounds, it definitely could add up, and you could pick and choose where you would spend your time and money.
Okay.
So we got a Chrysler exhibit. This one I thought was fun. So this one, again, a lot of these fairs would talk about developments in engineering, developments in architecture, developments in transportation, whatever. So there was an entire series of exhibits that were made that different states represented home building. And this is the Florida home. So it's a modular, again, kind of a modern style. You've got the chrome runners along the balcony on the top deck. This beautiful building still exists on the shores of Lake Michigan.
Wow.
So I don't know, and I couldn't find a reference to know if this was also painted pink at the time. To me, it's so white in this picture. I'm assuming it was white in the exposition, but I don't know. But here it was very clearly, you could see why it was called the Florida House. I mean, that's absolutely flamingo pink. But you can see Lake Michigan is in the background. So they say
has a Frank Lloyd Wright style a little.
Yes, it definitely has that prairie, that flat, and Frank Lloyd Wright was also in this area, in the Chicago area. I think though this one did get it was built by Florida or paid for by Florida, but I don't know who designed it. So they might have used a Midwest architect, but it's just got these great lines attached to it. And there were, I think the article that I found, there were 5 or 6 of these that did survive past the 1933 World's Fair, but they've since fallen into disrepair and have been destroyed since then. This is the only one that still exists from that original set. And it's a pretty impressive piece. But what they did was when they bought them, I don't remember who bought it. They said somebody bought them, and then they actually paid people to live in the homes as their caretakers. So it's like they were trying to keep them as some sort of architectural significance, but I don't remember who it was that did it. And it's just, again, they weren't necessarily designed to be long-standing homes. And some of them, they just couldn't keep up with some of the repairs. So unfortunately, they fell into disrepair. But the Chicago World's Fairs, again, I mentioned about how popular and how voluminous some of their availability of collectibles are. You've now moved into the 5,000 level of what's listed on eBay right now. And that's only across 2 World's Fairs. That's more than was listed across all 5 of the Paris World's Fairs. So you're getting into an era that there was more ephemera, particularly ephemera. There's more ephemera being made available. So you've got, this is an original scrapbook, one of a kind that's kind of moving into its own category. But, again, photography was becoming in the hands of the common man. So you could have a lot of photographs either that you took yourself and now you could collect later, or that would have been taken at the time. Now, Soldier's Field was another case that was not down at the World's Fair. It's actually closer to the downtown. So I'm not sure what the connection to that would be, but, fairly significant piece. A doll like these again are listed, doesn't necessarily mean that we're getting. So let's look at what actually has sold, and you'll see where some big ticket items come in. This is a 5-foot long tapestry. So it's probably one of a kind. It probably, hung on the walls of one of the buildings. They tried to sell it for $900. They took the best offer, and it took $276 to ship it. So wow. We've got a fairly specialty item there that probably was one of a kind. Again, I can't imagine there would have been too many of these made. It's a license plate showing you're a visitor. I don't know if this would have been available just as like anybody could have bought one as a souvenir, or if this, I have a feeling this was probably more, you know, if you were the Secretary of State or you were a state governor or you were somebody of importance that maybe was being chauffeured around the fair, you would have had then like a license plate you could have taken home. But I don't know, because I've never come across any more of these, but 29 people were fighting over this and it went up to $667. So they can't be that prevalent.
I saw earlier in the chat, our wonderful insulator guy was here and he was talking about how he had seen some of those license plates before.
Great. I mean, it's one of those that it's because things would have been more available to be made in production. I'm sure this one, there wasn't just one. Now this, I'm going to say was probably just one, because if it's a tapestry and it was 5 feet long, it was probably hung specifically to decorate a building. You know, I can't imagine they would have been selling it. I could be wrong. But that's why it's good to know what's been out there and particularly what has sold, because if you come across another one, all right, it's going to have some pretty good value. But if you suddenly come across 20 of them, all right, well, it's either a fake or now you suddenly found a hoard and you're never going to get $900 because there's not that many people that are going to want it. Because how do you display a 5 foot long tapestry? You know, that's relatively large, but you'll see a lot of ephemera, a lot of books, a lot of souvenir pieces, because they were easy things to take home and they would have been inexpensive at the time. You know, check out these little iron dogs, you know, again, probably would have been fairly inexpensive at the time. And I wouldn't have even known how you would know these are from the World's Fair. So probably somebody bought them and maybe made a little note that went along with it, so that the family remembered what they were from. But this one has the box. It says right here that it was an agate souvenir of World's Fair 1933. And that's something that I'm not going to say didn't exist in 1876, but it was much more rare because of the other stuff from 1876. The 1933 one is where things started really getting marked. You know, it was like, this is from the 1933 World's Fair. Like, it was very clear because they were very, very, very much being created as a souvenir piece of a fairly important a World's Fair. So a lot of stuff. Again, this is just over the last 90 days. 1,200 items have sold just in the last 90 days, just on the Chicago World's Fair. So,
Patrick, do you know when they started doing the souvenir books, or the books with all of the exhibits that will be at the World's Fair?
The first that I saw is the Chicago one from 1933. I haven't even found one from the 1893. The 1893, you will find, like, again, sometimes some postcards, sometimes some ephemera that will show an exhibit or a building, but I haven't found any that are a set that would have been bound together. That was those kind of souvenir programs I didn't start seeing until, actually I take that back. The 1904, this one has a program. So it's really the 20th century ones is where those started kicking in.
Okay, great.
So 1904, again, it should have been a celebration of 1903, would have been 100 years. It took a while to get it organized. So the 1903 centennial of the Lewis and Clark Louisiana Purchase got pushed in 1890 or 1904. And some of the significance of 1904. One, this is just a fun Instagram account that I found. It's literally an Instagram account of the 1904 World's Fair Society. So it has all kinds of eye candy that they've been posting, you know, including award. Like this was a crystal punch bowl that was on display. You know, this is like a building inside of a bigger building. You know, some of the architecture, the first public dirigible flown in America was at 1904 World's Fair. So there's a picture of it right there. The notable items from the 1904 World's Fair were the first wireless telephone, the first fax machine, the first X-ray machine. They had an incubator program, which that was the disturbing one. I thought I had a graphic of it, but I must not have grabbed it. So what they had done, the incubator itself was not invented in 1904. It was actually invented in 1888. But what they did at the 1904 World's Fair is they had a exhibit that was put up that was manned by 10 nurses, and they had 22 babies, infant, premature babies, in incubators on display, and you could pay 25 cents to go in and see the babies in these incubators. Unfortunately, when they first started it, they kind of knew what germ theory was, but they didn't take into consideration how many people were coming into the building, and a lot of the babies got sick and died. So they put up a partition to keep the visitors separate from the nurses and the babies, so that the rest of the babies survived. But by collecting 25 cents a head, they collected $181,000, which went on to buy incubators to go into hospitals around the country. So it was like a weird thing to do and maybe of a questionable taste, but the end result was a 100%, godsend to hospitals around the country who couldn't afford one of those incubators. So yeah, so but that was one of those examples of you had to pay to get in, but then you also had to pay for other exhibits. And so that was one of them. And they said was one of the more expensive, but you knew at the time you were putting in the money that the money was going to be donated to buy these machines for hospitals. So like, it was kind of almost maybe it's a little expensive, but it's almost like a charitable thing that people were willing to do it. So
now, correct me if I'm wrong, Patrick, but I do believe that this World's Fair had a Thomas Edison exhibit, because my great-grandfather, the one that started the KFVS radio station in St. Louis, remembers going to this World's Fair, and his mother writes in our biography we have that she believes he saw the electricity exhibit and was fascinated by it, and sparked his love for learning technical things, and really his love for wanting to start the radio station years later.
Oh, that's fantastic. I don't know specifically, because that would have been one of the many exhibits, and they definitely had St. Louis was known as the electrified fair, but one of the reasons the Chicago one of 1893 was known as the Great White City was because it also had electricity. So it wasn't that electricity was invented at either of the fairs. It was just being put on display, far more prevalent than anything else. And I would be surprised if Edison wasn't there somehow representing, because I don't know when the AC, DC, the alternating current, direct current, where those debates all happened. He might have still been fighting some of that stuff, but I wouldn't be surprised at all that he was at the 1904 fair. So they've just had some amazing pieces, and including the one I had written down, the waffle style ice cream cone was represented at this fair.
What a great invention, right?
Yes. And there's also like a little subtext, which is a little interesting. So St. Louis had tried to claim the 1893 exposition, and he went to Chicago. And so they were a little bitter about it. And so in 1904, 1903, when it was supposed to be built, that was also the time they was coming up for the time of the Summer Olympics. And the Summer Olympics were supposed to be in Chicago. And St. Louis pitched a fit that you couldn't have two international, draws or two things to bring international people in two different cities in the United States. Like today, they're only about 4.5 hours apart, but back then you would have been at least a day, if not 2 days apart. So it wasn't going to be easy to get people from St. Louis to Chicago to see the Olympics and then also see the World's Fair. So they lobbied to get them stripped from Chicago to get the Summer Olympics of 1904 in St. Louis, which they did. So Chicago has still never hosted the Olympics. So that was the only bid Chicago ever had won to get the Olympics, and we lost them. And then the 1904 Olympics only had, I think, 14 countries participate because they couldn't get there. There was no easy way to get to St. Louis. It was just not it was the fourth largest city at the time, but it was fourth by a long shot, because you had New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago were the top three, and then St. Louis was way down the list. So if they got them, but unfortunately it wasn't. I think the top winning country for medals was America, and I think we won something like 116. And then the number 2 country was Germany. They won 13. So there was not a lot of international representation. And then there's also, and this kind of like goes into contemporary research, because it's really kind of fascinating. Yeah, let's all think back to 1904. We were a country filled with immigrants, and there were a ton of people that participated in the 1904 Olympics as quote unquote Americans, but had not actually picked up American citizenship yet. So there's a lot of research being done. Like we found articles as recently within the last 10 years where Italian Americans are researching, saying, well, wait a minute, this winner of such and such of whatever the sport was in the 1904 Olympics was technically Italian, even though he was competing under the American flag. So technically Italy won that sport. Now, I don't know if you can take that because America would have paid for him. They would have paid for his hotel. He did it under the American flag. I'm sorry, he was American, but it is interesting because especially if we look at immigration status and things like, well, what makes an American? And these people legitimately did not have American citizenship. So maybe they weren't American when they competed. Now, what's notable for the collectability standpoint is St. Louis only hosted the one. So whether you're looking for the 1904 World's Fair or the St. Louis World's Fair, you're only going to ever come across one set of information. And there's still quite a bit of it because, again, you're moving into the 20th century. It's a little bit earlier than the 33 that we were talking about. So, a lot of the graphics are still going to be in black and white, so your sepia tone. But, $3,500 for a Stereopticon cards from the 1904 World's Fair. Stereopticon cards do not sell for much individually, but if this is the complete set specifically from the World's Fair, there's this asking price, but there would definitely be some value. Here's a judging pin. There can't be a lot of these, if this is the juror, so there probably were only a small number. It looks like this was maybe a do-it-yourself display, but in a very impressive frame, some cool pieces, so like a one-of-a-kind art piece. But if we go into the sold pieces, you end up getting into what you actually see sell, or what people are actually collecting hard money for. And the items that were going to be really popular in the St. Louis World's Fair, again, are going to be the items that didn't have huge production. There's going to be a lot of things that would be ephemera or have lower price points. But again, this is an award. There were probably only a handful, if not only one, issued and sold for $2,400, just back on September 29th. This porcelain tobacco jar probably would have had more than one made, but can you find another one that has the entire lid still in one piece with the handle still in one piece, with this, this beautiful, it even has the Moriage on it. I don't remember my buildings at site, so I don't know what building that was, but so that one sold, only had one bidder, but it did sell for $675. More medals. Medals come up a lot because they were awarded for a lot of different things. That was actually what was interesting about the 1904 Olympics, because again, this is the Olympics. 1904 Olympics is actually what introduced the gold, silver, and bronze system. That didn't exist prior to that.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I don't know if they still had like first, second, and third, but the 1904 was where they first introduced gold, silver, and bronze. Now, Paris in 1900 was the first Olympics outside of Greece. So again, we're not dealing with a lot of history here, but St. Louis does claim that they were the ones that introduced that concept, whether it was their idea or the Olympics, I have no idea. Some ephemera, a World's Fair gold brick. Cool. So quite a bit of pieces. You're going to come across them. I would say, and you can see by some of these price points, even for the more unique pieces, they're not going to run as high as some of the other, like the New York and the Chicago ones, because a lot of it is going to be based on popularity of the city. And no offense to Katie and her family, St. Louis is no longer the fourth largest city in the country. So there aren't as many people trying to collect that specific World's Fair. So that is going to keep some of the prices down. But when you get into one-of-a-kind pieces, like this is going to be desirable regardless of what fair it came from. It's an absolutely gorgeous piece. Yeah, exactly. And somebody would want to have that in their collection. Who cares if it was the St. Louis or the New York or the Philadelphia? It's just a gorgeous bronze piece. Same thing with the porcelain. So some things are going to elevate beyond, but although that one is specific to the fair.
That tobacco jar is gorgeous,
isn't it? So all of the stuff that I've been going up to has been really still this prior to this BIE, the Bureau of International Expositions. the significance of the Bureau is really they were just trying to organize and solidify and officiate stuff that had already been happening to make sure, like you had one of the questions earlier, well, who got to do the fair? And there's a really, really interesting subtext to this. So we're like this first list we've kind of covered. We're now in the first system. And don't worry, I'm not going to do that level of depth to the other systems. But the first system is after the BIE took over. If people are really familiar with the history, and particularly familiar with New York, if you really study this list, there's going to be something on here that is actually not on here. There's something missing. And it's one of the most well-known World's Fairs in the history of the World's Fair system. It's the 1964 World's Fair of New York. It's not here. And it's because when the BIE was structured, they created a system that said, and I mentioned this earlier, they created a system that said one country cannot have more than one World's Fair or Expo more than once every 10 years. So if we go down on this list, in 1962, Seattle got the World's Fair, and that's where the Space Needle came from. So in 1962, Seattle got the World's Fair. Now the first New York World Fair, the 1939 one, that is on here. But again, 1939, war was about to break out. Long story short, the New York World's Fair didn't make any money. So the organizers were still around in the 60s, and they were still trying to figure out how, like, World War II is over. Like, what can we do? They decided they wanted to have another World's Fair in 1964 on the grounds of the 1939 World's Fair. They were using the same roads. They were going to reuse all of this. So they went to the BIE and said, hey, we want to do this in 1964. Will you change the rules and allow us to have two World's Fairs back to back, or from 62 to 64? The BIE said absolutely not. The whole reason we're here is to make sure that doesn't happen. And New York, in the typical New York fashion, said, well, screw you, we're going to do it anyway. So the 1964-65 World's Fair technically is not a World's Fair. It called itself a World's Fair, it called itself an Expo, it did everything the way the 1939 one was done, but it was not legit, and they pissed off a lot of people. So
I never knew that.
Yeah, neither did I. I mean, it's one of those. It's like one of the most famous structures, like the Unisphere. We'll go into the New York one, but it's like because it's one of the more. There are people that are probably watching this show right now or watching this discussion that probably went there. You're getting into pretty modern times, and then to find out, no, you didn't go to a World's Fair. You went to like a mock World's Fair, or you went to like a illegal World's Fair. It's like, I don't know what you consider it, but in true New York fashion, they just didn't care. They held it anyway. And then poor Munich a year later was like, what about us? Because the fact of the matter is New York said, well, I don't care. We're still going to invite all these countries to participate. And all these other countries were like, America wants us to do something? Sure. And so they went to the 1964 World's Fair, and then they didn't have any money to go to the 65 Munich World's Fair.
Poor
Munich. So they attended, but they like recycled some of their same exhibits. Like they didn't have anything to talk about because they just showed it. So there's definitely some things that happen over time that as the systems, so the BIE is the one that would determine who got the fair. So it's just like the Olympics now. You would have to put in to say, we want to do this, and this is when we want to do this. Because I'll give you a little sneak peek. Before I started this, I should have asked, when was the last World's Fair? And if anybody had asked me, I would have said New Orleans, because I knew about the 1984 New Orleans one. I went to the 82 one. I didn't think any existed beyond that. Well, damn, look at how many have existed since then. Peterson said that she went to the 92 one. And then there's all these, including one coming up in 2025. And I'll do a little spoiler. The Dubai one is happening right now. It started 16 days ago. Wow. It started October 1st. Did anybody know that Dubai was having a World's Fair right now? Nope, I didn't. So we'll talk about that. So they're still going on. So it's just like the Olympics. So you put in a proposal to say, I want to do this. This will be my theme. This will be, in some cases you have to go pretty elaborate because you have to say, well, this is the infrastructure I'm going to have available. These are the buildings that I want to build, architecturally, this is the style I want to do it. And then they will determine who do they want to have the expo. And some of them will be called World's Fair, some may be called the Expo. Like the naming terminology, I'm sure there's a true difference, but I couldn't figure it out because I always thought they were like every 10 years or so. But you can see some of them, this one, they're 2 in the same year. You know, things got a little crazy in a couple of these places. But as you got more contemporary, I think the world of a 24-hour news cycle, the purpose of the World's Fair shifted a little bit. So I think, you know, they're by design, they're not as colloquially, they're not as popular as they once were. So let's get back into the history. So I did talk about the BIE. What's noteworthy about the BIE is there are 170 member countries. So technically there could be any one of the 170 could host. But if you're officially a sanctioned event, those would be the 170 members who would get an invitation to participate. Now, they may not choose to participate. They may not be able to afford to participate, so they're not required, but that's technically what the BIE is structured. So we get back into the actual list. Once the BIE came about, we're going to jump into the New York one. So there were 2, even though only one is shown, 1939 and 1964. So again, the 1939, we've got the... Again, some of them would have icons or structures. These no longer exist, but this is the Trilon and the Perisphere. So you will see a lot, again, we're getting into the 30s, 40s, you're getting into collectibles that a lot of ephemera, a lot of inexpensive production was done. This image of the golf ball with the golf tee next to it is very prevalent. So it's the Trilon and the Perisphere. So that's the 1939 World's Fair. And then this is the one from, oh, I just forgot it. What's the Will Smith movie? The aliens. Men in Black. So a lot of people recognize this. If nothing else, they recognize it from Men in Black. So this is the Unisphere. And what's noteworthy is both the Unisphere and the Trilon and Perisphere were built on the same grounds at the same time. Or not at the same time, but like in the same locations. So there's not a lot left from the 39 World's Fair. There's a little bit more from the 1964, but again, not much. There's a great video that I had pulled up, and it just showed a video of the 39 World's Fair because there isn't a lot that's left. Literally, the only thing that's left, and it only exists because of the 64, the pathways were all marked. And so some of the stones in the pathway said it was the Avenue of the Africas or Avenue of the Americas. Like there are some things that you can still find if you go to Flushing. It's a New York World's Fair, but it's in Flushing. So you can still find some representation, but this video, it's relatively short and I'll kind of clip through it. But this showcases some of the individual, an actual video taken of the 1933 World's Fair. So there you can see the Trilon and the Perisphere in the middle of everything. And so what you're seeing with all these streets all still existed, and that's where the 64 World's Fair was recreated with all new structures, but they still have the same footprint.
$155 million wonderland.
Oops.
Wow.
By every mode of travel, every means of transportation, they arrive to view the marvels of the greatest exposition in history. Outstanding landmark is the theme center, while the 4 freedoms, speech, press, assembly, and religion, overlook Constitution Hall. 30 feet high, they symbolize the 4 rights of free Americans guaranteed by the Constitution. The 700-foot trial.
So again, if you just kind of look at the scale as people are in these walkways, how big some of these pieces were built, even though they were temporary, to go around. It's like this is a
patriotic masterpiece by James Earl Fraser. Everywhere sculptured settings.
Yeah, so that statue of Washington was something like 65 feet tall. You know, some of these pieces were just massively built. Again, considering they weren't going to stick around.
I mean, the scale is just absolutely impressive.
As does Maine most northern.
So you just kind of highlight some again. So we got the General Electric Plaza. You
Love
look at
that light and
the
gold.
ginormous light, the switch.
Building that houses the electric utilities display. Here is emphasized the forward march of America, resistless as a torrent's flow through a transparent tunnel.
Yes, you get to walk through the Niagara Falls.
79-foot drop into the world of tomorrow. It's
I don't think OSHA would
the
approve this
greatest
today.
No.
And then they also had kind of the sideshow aspect, you know, where you'd have the stuff that you could do for fun. You know, so this is just a really fun video that just highlights, because so much of this is gone. There's not as much that I could find even in the souvenirs to show some of the highlights from that. But the New York World's Fair is one of the most collected World's Fair, primarily from the illegal one. So I even have probably a dozen pieces of the Unisphere, because you're crossing into the cross collectability of globes. So I have a globe collection, and I would say about half a dozen are specifically I bought for my globe collection that were actually the Unisphere from the '64 World's Fair. So
I always
again,
find it funny, Patrick, whenever I see these old clips, the old footage, that this one guy must have got a lot of voiceover work, because it sounds like the same guy.
Yeah. He knew where his bread was buttered. He came back and did that all the time. So if you showcase, so this is showing the solds first. You know, again, cross collectability, but it's Batman, Superman, and Robin at the New York World's Fair at the 1939-40 World's Fair. So this was a 1940 comic book, and it's only a 6.5 grade, so it's not a super high quality rating. Wow. And it was listed for $6,000. Now it did best offer, but you know, you're probably still, this one sold for $4,900, and it was actually a lower grade. This is only a 6. So you've got definitely, you know, so these are the most expensive. That's the earlier World's Fair, but this is the later World's Fair. So again, we're only in the 60s. We're within the lifetime of a lot of people probably watching this show right now. And some of these pieces, like this was a storefront display. Now I didn't go in to figure out where, but you know, it's an absolutely beautiful representation. And it's just as likely that this got sold to a globe collector than it got sold to a World's Fair collector. So the fact that
like storefront displays.
Absolutely. So you got the advertisers. They could be anything that's going to build that up, because the Unisphere is a globe. And so I find that most of the pieces that were going for big bucks were from the 64, because then I think you're also tying into that personal connection. Like I went to that fair. I remember seeing that, or I bought one of those as a kid. I bought a can of Ballantine ale. I want it again. So
Patrick, you went to the Expo, the World's Fair, with that globe there.
No, this one I did not. I went to the I'm not quite that old. Thank you, Nate.
Oh no, of course you're not. Sorry.
No, I went to the 80. I went to the 82 with the Sun Sphere. So again, there's some pretty, but if you just, as we're scrolling down, you can see there's still a lot of
land.
I'm sorry.
There's the Progress Land from GE, which is cool. You can look up videos of that, folks. It's really amazing to see what they had there.
That's true. I forgot about that. Yep, he took that from the World's Fair, and it's now at Disney World, right?
Yes.
That's the one. It's Disney World, not Disneyland. You know, a set of small posters, but they're original print. You know how far down I've gotten, and we're still in pretty big ticket items. This set of World's Fairs is far more collectible than the others. You know, again, this is from the 39. The 64 tends to be more, but you also figure there's more New Yorkers. You know, if you get the local aspect, there's going to be more New Yorkers fighting for some of these as opposed to the St. Louis ones. So it's, you know, Czechoslovakia shall be free. You know, so this is the 39. So again, you're getting some political ones because we're about to enter World War II. And after World War II, things did change, but you know, it's interesting that there would have been something, you know, with the swastikas on it, like that this was from the World's Fair. You know, you don't make that cross connection, but you know, badge again, 1939, another version. Now this looks really faded because look at, like, you don't even see that his suit's not even blue. So that one only sold for under 600. So that one didn't, and it wasn't rated. So, you know, you can still sometimes find deals. Another one of those Progress Lands went for 4 people were fighting over it for almost $600. Wild West Show. Okay, this was actually the 1901 Buffalo. We didn't cover that one. The General Electric, again, the Progress Land of a medallion paperweight. There's just some really cool pieces, and as you get into the more contemporary ones, more people will recognize them and more people will want them, which will raise the price. Now, I mentioned the Seattle one. I'll just mention it really, really quickly because the significance of the 1962 one is it wasn't Seattle's fault, but they're the reason New York did not get a true World's Fair. Now, would it have made a difference? Probably not. But, you know, we did get the item that carries over, everyone recognizes the Space Needle. So that came from the 1962 World's Fair, as did the monorail system. And so this is another one, a very short video. I love the videos put out by Pathé. They just do some great commentary videos. This is Peter Roberts. We'll see if it's the same, if that's the same voice.
A sneak preview of Century 21.
And the same issue as the New York World's Fair. You're again getting into contemporary time, but because of its location and the population that's surrounding Seattle, it won't have as many people fighting for it because not as many people would have attended it. You simply just have a bigger geography. You've got a bigger population that was within a 2 or 3 hour drive at that time of New York than within a 2 or 3 hour drive of Seattle. So you're going to have more people that will have a personal memory of the Seattle one or of the New York one than the Seattle. So when you get the pieces that come up, they've only held the one World's Fair. So you can see the number of items that are for sale have dropped significantly. We're back to only 1,300. Some of them have big tickets, but again, the pieces that are going for the big money, you know, a welcome banner, there couldn't have been that many of those, you know, so this would have either been a street banner or from a pavilion. It's probably one of only a handful that were made. Some coin sets, you know, coins tend to go for some big bucks, but again, these are all asking prices. If we jump to the sold prices, you'll see a couple things that are at a high end. I couldn't figure out what these space age silver tone metals were. I opened up the links and there's the top two items are both the same thing. I never figured out what that was, but I mean, you drop that, you've got a pretty cool model pen display. So you've got the backing card. Isn't that a great advertising piece? You know, but again, this would probably be just as collected by an advertising collector or even a pen collector than specifically somebody who wants the World's Fair from Seattle. So, you know, so that's got a pretty decent price point on it that sold.
And on that one, it's cool. You can see the monorail going around by because, you know, there's nothing like being on that monorail when you go to Seattle and seeing the Space Needle from the front window. It's just so cool.
We only had one bid on the motion lamp, you know, so again, kind of cool piece. So a couple big ticket items, but we're seeing we're dropping precipitously in what the value of some of the items, you know, some of the coins and the metals are still holding some value. But even some of the, like the books, we're just dropping quite a bit into its value. So it's still a collectible, definitely a collectible. And it's because George, the antique nomad, also sometimes lives and works in the Seattle area. He always picks up Seattle World's Fair items, but he picks it up to sell in Seattle. So this becomes one of those cases that if you're doing local shows or you have a booth and you're buying it to resell, Seattle may not be your best one to pick for resale unless you can get something for a really inexpensive price. There's always going to be a market to sell everything.
And that's a Seattle LGBTQ metal pin brooch.
It says gay way. So that one I'm not, but it says 1962 on it. So that's like a little cutting edge. And I could see why that would have gone for such a high price. There's definitely going to be older pieces that celebrate the LGBT culture is going to be fairly rare. Glassware, you know, again, a pin set. So again, there is definitely a collectability for Seattle, just not as collectible as some of the others. I really threw in here really quickly because I personally have sold some items from the Montreal Expo. So Expo 67, that one, the biggest structure was actually the American Pavilion. That's this big geodesic dome that was built that actually burned the skin to it burned to the ground, but the structure still exists. That's actually one of the few structures that's still standing from the Montreal Expo 67, that and Habitat 67, which is a really cool, I wonder if I took a picture, if I have a picture of it. Oh yeah, I did. So Habitat 67 is this set of this is a housing development that the architect took the idea of how Lego blocks go together. He wanted to create these garden systems and then these apartments across all these floating condos into the structure. So it still exists. They're notorious for leaks. They're notorious for structural problems and heating and cooling issues, but they're amazing, modernist pieces of architecture that definitely will be, I'm assuming they're landmark protected, even though they're only from 67, because no one would want to see them go away. But there was a really cool, there we go. There's the fire. So that is the biosphere that had been the American exhibition. And now the frame is still there, and they just have botanicals growing on the inside of it. So it's just a cool adaptive reuse for what was once the American exposition. Pieces of that do come up. Again, Montreal only ever had one, so there's not as many, but it is more contemporary. So there's still 2,300 pieces listed. The most valuable pieces being more of a one-of-a-kind. Photography gets a little dicey about what the true value is. So if you go to sold comps, this was going to be 5.2 grams of gold is going to sell for good money regardless. But even that only sold for $176. License plates for 97. This kind of a lot with scarf, only sold for 80. So the prices aren't holding as well. For as much as I love the city of Montreal, and I think some of the significance even by 67, I think to a certain extent, the World's Fairs were starting to, run down a little bit, and the popularity was running down. So Montreal was not a huge one. Knoxville was probably the last big bang, and that was the 1982, the Sun Sphere. That was the main structure, and that does still exist. It was represented in an episode of The Simpsons. They turned it into the world of wigs, and it fell over at one point because they were like mocking the fact that it was this weird structure that had no purpose in life at all in the middle of Knoxville, Tennessee. So that was the Sun Sphere.
It's a very interesting structure.
It is an interesting structure, and it's no less weird than the Space Needle or some of the other things that got built. And the fact of the matter is, because it's one of the most recent ones, there's a lot of stuff out there, because now we're into people of our age, or my age, where I went to this, so it's like I have a personal memory of it, that when you come across items, you may want to recreate them. I even had picked up for my mystery boxes, there are 4 people somewhere in the country right now that have a Coca-Cola themed Knoxville Sunsphere cup, because I got them at a really good, inexpensive price. So I put one in each mystery box. So they're not particularly valuable. So this is an original illustration, so that's obviously going to go more. An entire collection, will a beer collection go for $375? That's iffy. So if you show what things actually sell for, the most expensive thing selling in the last 90 days is only going for $125. So if somebody's just interested in building a World's Fair collection, this would be one of those, like, hey, why don't you take into consideration building some of these pieces, because you can build up a fairly quick collection inexpensively. This is a World's Fair beer collection. It sold for under $99. A Holly Hobby, no, that's not Holly Hobby. Strawberry Shortcake, went it up for $100. It's a badge, but it's a new old stock. So there's some value to the fact that it's never been opened. T-shirts, some of this stuff, there's gonna be a lot of it that still exists, because I remember when I went to the World's Fair, it was a big deal. Even though it wasn't local, I was in Illinois and it was in Tennessee, but it was, we planned for it for months. We bought our tickets, months in advance. And so when you went there and you got these souvenirs, you kept them. And so you've got families that are, suddenly unearthing some of this stuff that's just been shoved into boxes and it's coming out for sale. There's not as much of a market for it. So you can see how quickly some of these price tags are going down, because they're just, a whole lot of memorabilia. 28 people were fighting for it, but it only went for $41. They're not going to be huge ticket items, because they're really more fun, and they're probably going to be sold to someone either from Knoxville who doesn't have that specific piece, or somebody who went to the fair that's just trying to recreate, kind of a cool little collection that has some personal significance. So do we have, before I go the rest, do we have any questions that popped up on any of those?
I don't see any questions.
Okay. So really, I only got us into the very first part of the second system, and I never really explored what the second and third systems were. So you can see there's a whole bunch of others. I didn't want to go into them, but there are a handful that I had skipped over that I just want to note because the structures are what dictates some of the collectability, and it's going to be what you probably recognize. So as Nate mentioned earlier, there was an exhibition in New Zealand. I've got to include the New Zealand exhibition, although I never found anything about it. But damn it, you even told me how to pronounce it. Dunedin?
Dunedin.
Hey, I got it right. So
New Zealanders would probably pronounce it more Dunedin, but Dunedin.
So this would be one of the buildings, the exhibition building. Again, 19th century, we're talking about. Hey, do you notice this building still exists, Nate?
I'm not sure if it does.
So most likely the fact that it's represented probably was the structure. And back then, it probably was the only structure. You know, it's really the first ones didn't have these multiple buildings and the midways and all the other things. So it's possible that still existed or existed for a while. It may have fallen into disuse. But so there was a New Zealand one. If you're lucky enough to find something from that, Nate will probably buy it from you. This has significance to me. I've seen this. This is the Atomium. This is from the Brussels, Belgium, New World's Fair in 1958. This structure shows up a lot after 1960s. It's just a really cool build. It is a building. So it's just a really cool building. It shows up on a lot of images that not necessarily tied to the World's Fair, but it is from the World's Fair. So it's worth noting if you come across that structure, it's collectible in its own right because it's a three-dimensional representation of an atom, and it's just kind of cool. And I've seen it in person. Another one, much less significance, because again, we're getting into the later ones, and they started, to a certain extent, I think the BIE was hurting themselves. They started approving a fair after fair after fair after fair. If you remember, the Montreal Fair was 67. Well, now we're in San Antonio in 68. So unless these countries are all just going to like put their exhibits in a suitcase and carry it with them, it's going to be hard to recreate new exhibits each time. But this one does have the Hemisphere Tower, and this does still exist in San Antonio. So this would be another structure. Architecturally, it's probably a little bit less interesting than the Space Needle. Space Needle has a lot more angularity to it, but probably a little bit more interesting than the Sun Sphere. So just be aware that if you see this type of a structure, you're dealing with the 68 Expo from San Antonio, Texas. And then we are getting, again, more contemporary. This is the 2010 Shanghai World Expo or World's Fair. This structure, again, has some significance and has some legs because you're getting into contemporary architecture, postmodern architecture. This is showcased in architecture magazines. Doesn't necessarily get credited as something from the World's Fair, but if you see it, it is connected. It was built for the World's Fair. There is some, connection to that. And then I kind of gave us a spoiler alert earlier that it is significant to note that the Dubai World's Fair is going on right now. It was supposed to be in 2020. Obviously, COVID postponed it. So it started in October 1st. From October 1st to March 31st is the Expo Dubai. They've got this great video that's showcasing it.
Come for the greatest global gathering in history. Discover the world's most inventive ideas. Marvel at the world's most inspiring architecture. Experience the world's greatest entertainment. Take in inspirational art, sample exotic cuisines, and witness more than 190 countries and cultures come together in one place. Join the making of a new world.
So tickets are available to that now. And what I find interesting is you could get a day pass for the equivalent of about $28. You can get a pass where you can go as often as you want for an entire month for about $56. So
that's not bad.
So it's really like what Nate was saying for the New Zealand one is in some cases, they're really marketing to come back multiple times, particularly when you're on an island nation like Dubai, that you're going to have a limited of who can get there. They're saying you could buy a pass for the month of October. You can buy a pass that runs for 30 days from the first day you use it. And you're right. I don't feel that that's a bad price at all for access to all of these. And because I had talked so much about what some of the structures that were left behind, I came across the section of their website, which I thought was fantastic. So they showed this really quickly through that little short video, but this is part of the grounds of their exhibit. And they actually are already saying that when this ends in March 2022, this will stick around and it's going to create an integrated mixed use community and carrying on fulfill Expo's founding vision to be an ecosystem to connect, create, and innovate. Wow. So this was like, I'm not sure what these individual structures represent. If they're solar panels, I don't know what this is. But the fact that, again, it's not like they would suddenly say, oh, let's pick a name out of a hat, which building sticks around later. This one's actually been planned to the extent that when they built this section, I mean, the fact that these buildings within this are LEED gold and platinum certified, that's nothing to sneeze at. These are not designed to be torn down. So they're already saying this is the part that's going to stick around, and this is why it's going to stick around, and what we're going to do as part of the Dubai World's Fair. And as I said, there's one more has already been approved for 2025 in Osaka, Japan. So they're still going around, but you can kind of see, other than the 2015 one in Milan, they're primarily in the Middle East and Asia. We had one in Germany. We had one in Portugal, another one in Spain, Italy. So there's some variation, but a lot of Asia is being represented. And you could tell by that video, there was that discussion in the beginning, like, what were they for? We seem to have gone back to like pure technology, pure advancements, pure like, what are we doing now? Or what are we about to do into the future? And so I could see architects going to this, engineers going to this, environmental engineers going to this, because they're trying to figure out the cutting edge of a very specific advancement. Because they did list some cultural stuff, like they said art and they said food, but a lot of that we can find on the internet. But to see a representation of some of this architecture, it's still a unique experience to see it all in one place.
And especially in Dubai, because Dubai is so innovative with the buildings that they've been doing in the last couple of years.
Absolutely. And, so again, they would have been approved for this years ago, and it was supposed to happen last year. So, they would say, okay, this is where we think we're headed. And then they'd steer themselves to make sure whatever they put into, you're on view for the rest of the country to see, or if that's the world to see. I mean, it's like, if your advancement isn't much of an advancement, Germany will mock you. So, they want to have the best, the best of the best on display. And so, yeah, Dubai has been able to put a lot of stuff, maybe planning for the expo, or just because they have that support system where they're paying their engineers, they're paying their scientists, they're encouraging that sort of research for the sake of research, as opposed to turning it into always a financial, having a financial gain behind it. And that's it. So that was for, like I said, there's tons of other expos, and there might be some that individuals have seen that I didn't cover, or that the BIE doesn't even consider an expo. But, these were some of the highlights that I wanted to show from my personal experience, and then also just as a good representation of how World's Fairs have developed over the time. So if there were no other questions, I think we can wrap things up.
It was a fascinating topic, Patrick. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I love Patrick. So much interesting information I just didn't know.
Thank you. I really enjoyed researching it because, like I said, it was something that, because I did go to the World's Fair, it's something I just always thought was cool. And I liked it from the cultural aspect and the architectural aspect, maybe a little bit the science, but that wasn't always I could care less how a machine works. It was just because back then, and, for a while afterwards, you didn't get it anywhere else. That's why I loved Disney World. That's why I loved Epcot, the World Showcase. It's like, okay, well, I'm not going to be able to see these cultures anyplace else. And although this is kind of like a literally Disney version of the culture, going to a World's Fair and being able to walk in. And I remember I had, unfortunately, I don't have it anymore, but I had this big book that you would carry with you from exhibit to exhibit, and you would get a passport stamp. Growing up in rural Illinois in the 70s, I didn't even have a passport, nor what a passport looked like. But, you know, heart to heart, they talked about passports all the time. And so the idea that I could get a passport stamp was freaking cool. So it's changed over time, because now it's not that big of a deal. We see television shows from around the world. You know, we can hop on a 24-hour news cycle. We see that stuff. But, you know, you think back to the 80s, the 60s, you know, the older World's Fairs, if you went to one, you were literally seeing a world you'd never seen before. And so it was really fun to kind of piece together, you know, like the fact that the 64 World's Fair wasn't a World's Fair. I find that absolutely hilarious. You know, even the differences with the Chicago World's Fair and all the controversy about the architecture. I think the 1893 World's Fair is beautiful, but to find out that people were mocking it at the time because it's not what Chicago was doing was shocking. Because I think we're proud of it, but not everyone, can't make everybody happy all the time. So I think we'll wrap things up. What do you got coming up on your channel coming up, Katie?
Lots of fun things happening this week for me. I'm hosting my first open collaboration, and I'm thrilled to be a part of the Ephemeral Challenge. So if you guys have your videos scheduled, I'll add them to the playlist. That will be very exciting. So that will go live October 20th, this Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, which is very, very fun. So looking forward to seeing everybody's videos in that collaboration. And then I will be hosting the next Tales from the Triptych on my channel coming up this Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern. And I will be talking about Fostoria coin and Fostoria Americana and kind of the differences between the reproductions and the originals. And I'll also be explaining the differences between Americana, which is Fostoria's pattern, Jeanette Cubist, and Indiana White. Also be a fun, great show on glass if you're interested in that wonderful era of Depression glass.
Excellent. And what do you got coming up, Nate?
Nothing necessarily on social media. We're still in lockdown here, so I am just trying to keep myself sane, really. I'm looking forward to your next sale on Friday. I hope you'll be having, because I missed the having the sale on Friday. I went a little bit spare not having that there.
I probably will not be having a sale. What I think I'll be doing is I'll be doing a live chat. I will still be traveling this week, and I'm not sure I'll be able to record a sale. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't bring anything to sell. So unless I find something to sell between now and then. So what I might do is I have found a couple things, but they're kind of for myself, or there's a couple things to resell. I might do like just a live chat and a haul video. I think I will be in a position to be able to do that. The problem is what I'm coming up to is work related, and I'm not sure all my evenings will be free. So watch my social media on that, and I will try and let people know, because normally on Wednesday nights, Katie and I are doing a duo dive. She will be hosting it, unfortunately, on her own. I will try and join if I can, but I can't commit to it. So my scheduling, my travel will hopefully die down a little bit within another week or two. But for now, I was home for less than 12 hours. I drove 6 hours to get home Thursday night, was home for less than 12 hours, and drove 12 hours again the next day. So I've been a little tired, and I'm still got a lot more driving to do. So it's a weird balancing act that I've got. So appreciate that you missed my sale, Nate. We'll try and come up with something to keep you happy. Right. And I saw in the chat, Auntie Christie made a fun comment that for people that do have World's Fair items, if you want to share them on Instagram, please tag us with the hashtag Tales from the Triptych. And it's not heavily used. Obviously, we're the only ones, we created it. So at this point, I don't think we need to create a different hashtag for each World's Fair or for each triptych. So just, tag it as hashtag Tales from the Triptych. And I would definitely like to see it. I did post some of my own. I didn't show them in this video, but I did post some of my own items. Some of them that I will be selling, and some that are mine. So those might be showing up in future sales, but there is a lot of cool stuff out there, and particularly from the 82 one, because things were just getting a little, I think they was taking itself less seriously to a certain extent. So they were like weird kitschy things that were being created. So I think there could be some fun things out there, but I would love to see stuff from the older ones. Like I love the stuff from the Columbia Exposition. My favorite exhibit at the at the museum there, the Museum of Science and Industry. They do an exhibit every few years that actually is, stone corbels and gargoyles and things that they salvaged from the exhibit, from the World's Fair, from that World's Fair. And it's just so much fun to see all that stuff. So if anybody's got stuff, I'd love to see it. Put it onto Instagram, hashtag Tales from the Triptych. And then you'll be able to do the same thing with Fostoria coming in next week when Katie does that one. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining me. Thanks so much, Katie and Nate, for hanging out and monitoring the chat, making sure all the questions got answered. And we will all see each other at some point on screen or in the chats. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for giving us your time. Thanks for putting your trust in Trusty Huckster. Have a great night, everybody.
Bye, friends.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.